Let's get to college football, where Dennis Dodd's latest power rankings ahead of Week 7 look like this. OU beating Texas moved them up 7 spots to 5th in the AP poll, but Dodd has them at 3. The team they beat, Texas, slides to 6. That's versus 9 from the voters. It'll be also interesting to see what Danny Kanell has to say in terms of whether he agrees or disagrees with what the Dodd father has to say and has on CBSSports.com. With that, we welcome in our senior college football writer, Dennis Dodd, and Danny Kanell from the Cover 3 podcast. So, Dennis, we'll start with you first on each of these naturally here. So OU surges to 3, and if you're a Michigan fan, you're saying, wow, you put the Sooners ahead of my Wolverines. Take us through the thought process here.
Well, look, Oklahoma to date has a better schedule, better accomplishments. Basically, they're Michigan with a win over Texas, which I would submit is maybe the second best win of the season. They beat a top 5 Texas. Texas beat Alabama at the time, but I would submit it could be the best win this season by anybody. When you consider that Texas probably still has the most talent it's ever had since the 2005 national championship team. They're going to rematch. I think we all kind of agree to that. In the Big 12 championship game, that will decide that. But the bigger story with Oklahoma is he knew Brent Venables wasn't going to go very long without a good defense. And he had a good enough defense on Saturday. They got after Quinn Ewers, sacked him, I think, 5 times. It was obviously a tie game at the end. That and the emergence of Dylan Gabriel, who really after the game poured his heart out. He missed the game last year because of concussion syndrome. He's playing with his second team in his 3rd conference. This is the pinnacle of his career. When you saw him find Nick Anderson on a play that Texas left him alone in the end zone. By the way, Nick Anderson's from Katy, Texas. How does that grind into Texas? But the game-winning touchdown, that fulfilled the destiny. But again, they're going to meet again and hash things out. But I think that's very fair for Oklahoma.
I do too. So I love what Oklahoma did. The win is there. The thing that kind of surprised me is Michigan at 4, because their resume isn't as good as Oklahoma's. Then I would say you probably have to, if you were just going off resumes, Michigan should probably be 8, 9, or 10. There's a bunch of teams that have better wins over Michigan. But here's where I would put Michigan at 2 behind Georgia. They've been the most impressive as far as the eye test goes, right? I mean, they've been dominating every single opponent, especially the last 2 weeks. What they did in Nebraska and what they did to Minnesota have been absolutely lopsided affairs. And I know we're nitpicking here where we are in the rankings because all 4 of these teams that we're discussing are in that top 4 of your power rankings. But I would base it off, if you said, all right, neutral field, who would be favored in these games? I would put Michigan as a favorite over Florida State and Oklahoma at this point. So I would have Michigan up there at 2, just ahead of Florida State and Oklahoma. And you're right, Dylan Gabriel, I think he replaced, and by most people, he has Quinn Ewers in the Heisman odds. He was totally flying under the radar. Even some Oklahoma skeptics were like, Oklahoma fans, were saying, man, Jackson Arnold, that's, freshman behind him could be playing, we might need him at one point this season. No one is thinking about that now. In fact, we're talking about Dylan Gabriel as possibly a Heisman favorite, if he continues to put up numbers, which he should.
It's a great thing about college football, right? Everyone has an opinion, and even our CBS Sports 133 has Michigan ahead of Georgia all the way at number 1. But both of you guys do like the Sooners there, but disagree maybe just a little bit on positioning. All right, we're in its phase also where college football has traditional basketball schools doing well. I feel like if this continues, guys, we're going to have Gary Parrish and Matt Norlander join us as well at some point. But Louisville and North Carolina, Dennis, just outside of the top 10 at 11 and 12, respectively, here for you.
Yeah, I mean, look, it goes into the whole parity thing. I wrote about it last week. 22 unbeaten teams going into week 6. That's the most after 5 weeks since 2012. And these basketball schools are part of it. Obviously, Kansas is back in this week. Louisville, North Carolina, UCLA climbs its way back in. But I love what's happened in the ACC. I started to think about this yesterday. You've got Florida State, North Carolina, and Louisville all undefeated. For the first time, at least in the playoff era, all 3 could finish 12-0 in the regular season without playing each other. How do you break that 3-way tie? Number 1 for the championship game, and you could be sitting there in the college football playoff with one of your teams 12-0 don't even have a chance to play for the college football championship. So I called the ACC, said, what are the tiebreakers? And basically it goes down to number 4, which is, I'm reading here, combined winning percentage of conference opponents. Okay, we don't know what that would be right now because they've got to play the game. The 5th tiebreaker is something called a team ranking metric in Sports Source Analytics. It's kind of the best analytics company out there. All the schools use it. I called the head of it, Drew Borland. He would not tell me where those 3 teams stood right now. But significantly, the 6th tiebreaker is Jim Phillips drawing the names out of a hat. So we can all root for that, I think.
Wow, that would be insanity. I mean, just the fact of 3 ACC undefeateds at the end. I don't think it happens, but if it did, you'd have to start having at least a conversation about 2 ACC teams in the playoff. But again, I don't think it happens. I had North Carolina slightly ahead of Louisville. Louisville's win over Notre Dame was good. It was impressive. They physically pushed them around, was probably the most surprising aspect of that. But I wasn't that impressed with some of other Louisville's wins. Georgia Tech, they struggled mightily, and you could even argue that Georgia Tech should have won that game. Same thing with NC State, road win, but by 3 was not as impressive. And North Carolina's month, the way they've been, handling their opponents, especially against South Carolina, they had 9 sacks. Minnesota won convincingly. Pitt won convincingly. And then when it all sort of culminated this weekend against Syracuse, you saw what they could be at their best. I think North Carolina is slightly better. I think their resume is slightly better. So I would have had them a tick over Louisville, but it is going to be fun to watch this ACC finish.
Louisville is going to be at Pitt this week, and North Carolina hosting Miami with Mario Cristobal. We're not even talking about what happened to the Canes, but obviously we know what happened over the weekend. So obviously there's disagreements here with different rankings and pollings, but it seems to be maybe consistent in agreement with USC guys that Caleb Williams, A, is still good, but that B, the Trojans defense still not very good. They continue to win, Dennis, but they fall with the AP voters and they fall with you as well.
Yeah, it had to be. After that performance, I stayed up and watched that late Saturday night. Caleb Williams, really for the last 2 weeks against Colorado, and then what should have been an outmanned Arizona. The only reason they're undefeated is Caleb Williams. I mean, his back must be getting sore because he's carrying the entire team. I don't know what the metrics are on missed tackles by USC, but I imagine they're among the leaders in the country in that respect. This sounds like heresy, but Caleb Williams to me is the closest thing in college to Patrick Mahomes in that he almost imitates him. He runs smart like him. He makes those off-schedule throws. And he's got a rocket for an arm. And what he did Saturday was incredible, where I don't know if you saw the play that won the game, 41-41 in triple overtime. You have to go for 2. The entire offensive line lined up on the left sideline together in a conga line. And he had a center, a couple of receivers, took the ball himself, and barely made it to the pylon to win the game. If that's not the definition of a one-man team, they almost told you by the formation what they were going to do. So it's very, very interesting. And that being said, I think Danny agrees it's only a matter of time for USC because now they've got to play these tough teams in the Pac-12. They play Notre Dame this week on the road. That defense cannot hang up.
No, USC, they brought Lincoln Riley to L.A. to bring his success that he had at Oklahoma. They're getting they're basically Oklahoma West now because Lincoln Riley, while he was in Norman, had teams that had awesome offenses and the defenses were subpar. I mean, it's the same exact makeup of this team. And it's ironic now that Oklahoma all of a sudden is a physically, dominant team, which they showcased against Texas. But I think they're going to have the same problem that they had. Here's the one big difference. The Big 12, that style of play worked. You could win conference championships getting into shootouts and playing basketball on grass. That doesn't work in the Pac-12 when you look at the physicality of the other teams in the conference. Oregon, look what they did to Colorado. Washington, look what they've done to several opponents. UCLA, whose defense, kept them in that game and won it this past week against Washington State. I thought this team was a playoff contender, but not this lopsided. They don't even have to be that good, Dennis. That's the thing that's sad about it. If they're just a top 20, top 30 defense, they're good enough to win a national championship, but they are atrocious on that side of the ball.
Guys, we could
if they're just average, Annie, if they're just average, like anybody in college football, if you're just average, you've got a chance.
And they've been struggling to cover some big numbers and talking about the Trojans from a gambling perspective. Lastly here, guys, since we're going in chronological order, we're ending with Kentucky, which won and got into the top 25 in large part to the win over Florida. They still remain in the top 25. But, Danny, I'm going to give you the floor this time because Dodd had them at 20. Now the voters have them at 24.
Goodness.
You have the floor.
I want to know. I had like coffee this morning. I spit it out. I did a double take. I said, Dennis, what are you drinking in your coffee? Because Kentucky, I would like to know what they've done outside of a game against Florida, which, yes, they ran the ball against Florida. I get that was impressive, but their resume is as weak as it's out there. And I thought they got exposed versus Georgia. That was flat out domination when Georgia put up 51 and blew them out there in Athens. I think there's several other teams that could be ranked higher. Wyoming, who at least you do have in there, but Missouri, there are other one-loss teams that I would have ahead of Kentucky. So I did a double take, Dennis.
That was a function of, and this is alibi time, that was a function of Kentucky being ranked 13th last week on the heels of the latest team to beat Florida and to get a boost in the rankings because of it. So 7 I thought was fair. Wyoming wasn't going to be ranked ahead of them. Missouri, I was just waiting for the bubble to pop. Look, this was more about what Georgia did than where Kentucky is. Georgia finally showed us that they deserve to be number one. You had various people in the AP and coaches polls giving them first place votes, but they put up, half 100 on Kentucky, basically telling Kentucky, you're still Kentucky. Ray Davis was held to 60 yards, 59 yards. And I thought it was really, really impressive that Carson Beck probably had the game of his career and showed that they have really good depth at receiver. Now that they've got, obviously, Brock Bowers out there. They've got some others. So it was more about Georgia. Yeah, Kentucky being 20 is an afterthought, but I'm not going to defend that much, maybe 2 or 3 spots, but you're right.
That's all right. There's going to be some clarification almost immediately because Kentucky and Mizzou will go at it. So the fringe of the top 25 and Dodd's top 25 rankings will be a little bit clearer when it's all said and done. All right. Thank you, guys, Danny Kanell and Dennis Dodd, for joining us here on HQ. I want to remind everybody about DK and the Cover 3 podcast. Tom Fornelli, Chip Patterson, Bud Elliott, and the gang. Week 6 instant reaction as OU downs Texas in that Red River rivalry. And boy, oh boy, didn't have time again here, but that Miami late game miscue and collapse all discussed on the Cover 3.